April 15th, 1945, 0900 hours. 3rd Army Headquarters, Germany. General George S. Patton stood over a map showing his armored columns driving deep into the collapsing Reich. In front of him lay the wreckage of Hitler's armies. Divisions surrendering wholesale, refugees flooding westward, resistance crumbling by the hour. "We can be in Berlin in 3 days," he told his staff. "Give me the gasoline and watch me end this war." 900 kilometers to the west, in SHAEF headquarters at Reims, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at the same map. But his expression showed not triumph, but calculation. His hand moved across the map, stopping well short of the German capital. "Berlin," he said quietly to his chief of staff, "is no longer a military objective." 72 hours later, Patton was no longer advancing. His tanks sat idling along the Elbe River while the Red Army closed in on Berlin from the east. The general who had turned speed into America's most devastating weapon had been stopped, not by the enemy, but by his own commander. This is the story of how the end of history's greatest war became a decision about the next one, and how the most aggressive general in the U.S. Army was sidelined at the moment he believed mattered most. Before we dive into this story, subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every view helps bring more stories like this to life. On April 1st, 1945, the Western Allies stood on the edge of total victory. The Rhine had been crossed. Germany's industrial heart lay exposed. Wehrmacht units were surrendering in formations so large that processing prisoners became a logistical crisis. From the skies, Allied bombers met almost no resistance. From the ground, American and British columns surged forward against an enemy that had already lost the will to fight. Yet this was not 1918. This war would not end with exhausted armies collapsing into armistice. This time, the victors would occupy the defeated nation completely, and whoever reached which territory first would shape Europe's future for generations. Every mile gained was no longer just a tactical advance. It was a claim on tomorrow. Supreme Allied Commander Eisenhower understood this. The war he was fighting had 2 fronts now, one against Germany's dying Wehrmacht, and another, far more delicate, with his Soviet allies, whose armies were racing westward with the same hunger for territory. And in the middle of this precarious balance stood George S. Patton, whose entire philosophy of war could be summed up in one word: forward. The decision Eisenhower was about to make would define how World War II ended and how the Cold War began. George S. Patton, Jr. did not believe in slow wars. To him, hesitation was the deadliest weapon an army could turn on itself. Speed disoriented the enemy. Pursuit prevented regrouping. A war stretched out gave politicians time to interfere, gave exhausted soldiers time to doubt, gave the enemy time to fortify. Patton's entire career was built on a single tactical religion: strike fast, strike hard, and never let the enemy breathe. He had proven it in Sicily, racing across the island faster than anyone thought possible. He had proven it again in France, where his Third Army covered distances in weeks that planners had allocated months to achieve. Patton didn't just win battles. He eliminated the space between them. His philosophy was brutally simple. Wars end when one side can no longer stand. Make sure it's not yours. Dwight D. Eisenhower fought a different war entirely. Where Patton saw the battlefield, Eisenhower saw the alliance holding that battlefield together. He commanded not just Americans, but British, French, Canadian, and Polish forces, each with their own national pride, strategic interests, and political masters. Every decision he made had to account for more than just military efficiency. Would it fracture coalition unity? Would it poison relations with the Soviets? Would it create a victory today that made peace impossible tomorrow? Eisenhower's genius was not in winning battles. It was in keeping fractious allies pointed in the same direction long enough to win the war. His style was deliberate, diplomatic, cautious. He understood something Patton refused to accept. Wars are won on battlefields, but peace is won in conference rooms. For most of the war, their differences made them stronger. Patton provided the aggression. Eisenhower provided the strategy. One broke through. The other held the line. Patton terrified the Germans. Eisenhower reassured the alliance. It was a partnership built on necessity, and it worked brilliantly until April 1945. Because now, with Germany on its knees and Soviet armies closing in from the east, the war Eisenhower was managing was no longer the one Patton was fighting. Territory didn't just need to be taken. It needed to be justified. Momentum wasn't just dangerous to the enemy anymore. It was dangerous to the alliance itself. As Germany collapsed, the very strengths that once made Patton indispensable now made him dangerous. On March 7, 1945, American forces crossed the Rhine at Remagen, the first time an invading army had breached Germany's natural western barrier since Napoleon. Within weeks, the floodgates opened. British and Canadian forces punched through in the north. Patton's Third Army stormed across in the south. By early April, the Allies had established bridgeheads along the entire length of the river. Germany's last major defensive line had shattered. The war, by any rational measure, was over. Except it wasn't. What followed wasn't a climactic final battle. It was a collapse. Wehrmacht units surrendered in formations so large they overwhelmed processing centers. Columns of German soldiers, hands raised, stretched for miles along roadways. Refugees, millions of them, flooded westward, desperate to escape the advancing Red Army. Entire cities fell without resistance. In some towns, American tankers found white flags hanging from windows before they even arrived. This should have simplified everything. Instead, it complicated everything. Because victory had transformed the war into something else entirely. A land grab with a ticking clock. Behind closed doors in London, Washington, and Moscow, diplomats had already drawn lines on maps, occupation zones that would divide Germany after surrender. The Americans would control the south and west. The British would hold the north. The Soviets would occupy the east. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, would be divided among all three powers. On paper, it was orderly, rational, fair. On the ground, it meant that every German town captured now carried a hidden question: who gets to keep it? Suddenly, battlefield decisions weren't just tactical. They were territorial. Every mile American forces advanced eastward was a mile they might have to surrender later. Every town liberated could become a bargaining chip. Every day spent racing forward risked arriving somewhere the diplomats had already promised to someone else. Eisenhower felt this pressure acutely. He commanded armies, but he answered to Roosevelt, Churchill, and the fragile alliance binding them to Stalin. If American forces pushed too far east, would the Soviets see it as betrayal? If they arrived in Berlin first, would it shatter the carefully negotiated zones and ignite a new conflict before this one even ended? Patton felt no such hesitation. To him, the answer was obvious. Take everything you can reach, then negotiate from strength. But that wasn't Eisenhower's war anymore. The closer the Allies came to victory, the more dangerous every decision became. Berlin wasn't just a city, it was the finish line. To the American and British public, the German capital represented everything the war had been fought to destroy. Nazi power, Hitler's regime, the heart of fascist evil. Capturing Berlin wouldn't just end the war, it would symbolize victory in the most visceral, undeniable way possible. Newspaper headlines were already being written. Photographers were positioning themselves for the iconic shot. Allied troops standing in front of the Reichstag. But inside SHAEF headquarters, Berlin looked very different. Military planners saw a fortress city of 3 million people, defended by desperate fanatics with nothing left to lose. Urban warfare at that scale meant brutal, block-by-block fighting through rubble and ruins. Rivers, canals, and defensive rings would turn every advance into a bloodbath. Casualty estimates ran into the tens of thousands, possibly higher. And for what? A symbolic victory in a city that, according to the agreed-upon occupation zones, would have to be shared with the Soviets anyway. Berlin sat 100 miles deep inside territory already designated as the Soviet occupation zone. Even if American forces took it first, they would eventually have to withdraw and hand over control. They would pay in blood for ground they couldn't keep. Winston Churchill saw this differently. The British Prime Minister understood symbols. He also understood power vacuums. In telegram after telegram, Churchill urged Eisenhower to race for Berlin, arguing that whoever occupied the city first would hold psychological and political leverage when the time came to negotiate Europe's future. The Soviets, he warned, were not just allies, they were rivals. Letting them take Berlin unopposed would send a dangerous message about Western resolve. Eisenhower refused. His reasoning was coldly pragmatic. The alliance with the Soviet Union had held through years of war, but it was fragile. Stalin was already suspicious of Western intentions. Violating the occupation agreements, even in spirit, could shatter trust at the worst possible moment. Worse, it could provoke a confrontation between armies that were supposed to be on the same side. The American public wanted Berlin. Churchill wanted Berlin. Patton certainly wanted Berlin. But Eisenhower calculated something else. The cost of taking it versus the cost of losing Soviet cooperation in finishing the war and building the peace. Berlin promised glory, but it threatened something far more fragile than armies, the alliance itself. While Churchill pushed for Berlin, Eisenhower's attention was being pulled in another direction entirely, south. Intelligence reports arriving at SHAEF headquarters painted a disturbing picture. Nazi leaders, the reports claimed, were preparing a final retreat into the mountains of southern Germany and Austria, an area that came to be known as the National Redoubt, or Alpine Fortress. The scenario seemed plausible, even logical. High-ranking SS officers, fanatical Hitler youth units, and die-hard party loyalists would withdraw into defensible Alpine terrain. There, supplied by hidden stockpiles and protected by natural fortifications, they could wage a guerrilla war for months, possibly years. The war that seemed nearly finished could drag on indefinitely, bleeding Allied forces in mountain ambushes and raids. The intelligence was fragmentary. Reconnaissance flights spotted construction activity. Intercepted communications mentioned troop movements southward. Reports spoke of underground factories, ammunition depots carved into mountainsides. Even rumors of Hitler himself planning to make a last stand in Berchtesgaden. It was terrifying, and it demanded a response. Eisenhower made his choice. Allied forces would pivot south. Patton's Third Army, instead of driving northeast toward Berlin, would swing toward Bavaria and Austria. The objective? Cut off any Nazi retreat into the Alps before the redoubt could be established. It was a strategic gamble based on incomplete information, and it diverted the full weight of American momentum away from the German capital. Historians still debate whether the Alpine redoubt was ever real. Post-war investigations found little evidence of the massive fortifications intelligence had suggested. No underground cities, no stockpiled supplies sufficient for prolonged resistance. Some argue it was Nazi propaganda, deliberately amplified to mislead Allied planners. Others suggest it was a genuine contingency plan that simply never materialized because the war ended too quickly. But in April 1945, Eisenhower couldn't afford to gamble on probably not real. If the redoubt existed and he ignored it, the war could stretch into 1946. If thousands of SS fighters vanished into the mountains and emerged months later to attack occupation forces, the cost would be catastrophic. Not just in lives, but in the fragile stability of post-war Europe. So he made the safer choice. Assume the threat was real and act accordingly. If Berlin was a symbol, the Alps were a nightmare, one Eisenhower could not afford to ignore. On April 15, 1945, the order came down from SHAEF headquarters. Western Allied forces would halt along the Elbe and Mulde rivers. They would not advance further east. Berlin was no longer an objective. The focus would shift south toward Bavaria and Austria to prevent any Nazi retreat into the Alps. It was a clear, definitive command, and it landed like a bomb among frontline commanders. At Third Army headquarters, George Patton read the order in stunned silence. His tanks were rolling. German resistance was non-existent in most sectors. Prisoners were surrendering faster than his forces could process them. Berlin lay roughly 100 miles to the northeast, less than 2 days at his current pace. He had the fuel. He had the momentum. He had an enemy that had already lost the will to fight. And now, he was being told to stop. "We're just going to sit here?" one of his staff officers asked, incredulously. Patton's response was blunt and bitter. He believed, correctly, that his entire operational philosophy was being dismantled at the moment it mattered most. Speed was his weapon. Pursuit was his doctrine. And now, with the enemy collapsing in front of him, he was being ordered to stand still and watch someone else finish the war. This wasn't a relief of command. Patton remained in charge of Third Army. His units weren't being reassigned. On paper, nothing had changed. But in practice, everything had. Without forward momentum, Patton had no role. His genius wasn't in defense or occupation. It was in relentless attack. Stopping him along the Elbe didn't remove him from the war. It neutered him. Other commanders accepted the order with pragmatic resignation. Omar Bradley understood the political reasoning. Bernard Montgomery had his own objectives in the North. But for Patton, restraint felt like betrayal. Not of him personally, but of the principles that had brought them this far. Wars, he believed, should be finished fast. Every day of hesitation gave the enemy time to regroup, time to escape, time for politics to complicate what should be simple. He had spent his entire career proving that speed saved lives by denying the enemy options. Now, he was being told to wait while those options multiplied. Patton could still see the enemy. He could still reach him. But he was no longer allowed to finish the war. On April 25, 1945, at 1:30 in the afternoon, patrols from the U.S. 69th Infantry Division reached the town of Torgau on the Elbe River. There they met soldiers of the Soviet 58th Guards Rifle Division. The moment was captured in photographs that would be printed in newspapers around the world. American and Soviet troops embracing, shaking hands, sharing cigarettes and rations. Smiles all around. Allies united. The enemy split in two. It looked like triumph. What it actually represented was finality. Germany was now physically divided. American forces held the West. Soviet forces controlled the East. Between them lay a line that wasn't drawn by battle, but by agreement. And that line would prove far more permanent than anyone standing on the Elbe that day could have imagined. The race to Berlin, such as it was, ended not with artillery barrages or tank columns crashing through streets, but with a handshake on a riverbank. From this moment forward, the war's military outcome was inevitable. Germany could not defend both fronts. Hitler's regime had days, perhaps hours, left. Surrender was no longer a question of if, but when. But the political outcome, who would control what, was already locked in place. The Western Allies would occupy Western and Southern Germany. The Soviets would hold the East. Berlin, despite sitting deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, would be divided among the victors as a symbolic gesture of unity. On the surface, it was orderly, rational, a triumph of Allied cooperation. Beneath the surface, it was a map of the next 50 years. Every town, every road, every mile of territory that armies occupied in these final weeks would harden into borders. Temporary occupation zones would become permanent political boundaries. The line where soldiers stopped fighting would become the line where the Cold War began. Churchill had warned of this. Patton had sensed it. But Eisenhower had made his calculation. Preserving the alliance mattered more than racing for symbolic objectives. Whether that calculation was correct would be debated for decades. But on April 25, 1945, as American and Soviet troops celebrated on the banks of the Elbe, the future of Europe was already being written. Not in the battles still to come, but in the ones that would never be fought. The guns had not fallen silent, but the future already had. On April 16, 1945, the Red Army launched its final assault on Berlin, 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, 6,250 tanks, 7,500 aircraft, 41,600 artillery pieces. So many that when the barrage began, the sound could be heard 40 miles away. What followed was not a battle. It was annihilation. Soviet forces encircled the city, then ground inward block by block, building by building, room by room. Berlin became a furnace of artillery fire, collapsing structures, and desperate close-quarters fighting. Hitler Youth members, some as young as 12, manned anti-tank guns in the rubble. SS units fought with fanatic determination even as the regime crumbled around them. Civilians huddled in basements while the city above them disintegrated. The Red Army paid for every yard in blood. Casualty estimates vary, but Soviet losses in the Battle of Berlin likely exceeded 80,000 killed, possibly far higher. German military and civilian deaths reached into the hundreds of thousands. The city was shattered beyond recognition, its grand boulevards reduced to canyons of ruins, its population traumatized, its future as uncertain as the smoke rising from its streets. And 100 miles to the west, American and British forces sat idle along the Elbe. They could hear the distant thunder of artillery. Intelligence reports brought news of the carnage. Refugees fleeing westward carried stories of the destruction. But Western troops did nothing. Not because they couldn't, but because they had been ordered not to. This was Eisenhower's decision made manifest. Patton watched it unfold with bitter vindication. This was exactly what he had warned against. Letting hesitation dictate strategy. If American forces had driven east when they had momentum, Berlin could have fallen with a fraction of the bloodshed. Speed, he believed, saved lives, not by avoiding battle, but by denying the enemy time to fortify. Instead, the Soviets fought the war Patton would have prevented. On May 10, 1945, Berlin surrendered. The swastika flag atop the Reichstag was replaced with the Soviet hammer and sickle. Victory belonged to Stalin's armies, and so did the city. The Western Allies had won the war, but they had lost the capital. Berlin fell, but not to those who could have taken it. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. Allied flags flew over a shattered continent. Millions celebrated in the streets of London, New York, and Paris. After 6 years of total war, the world could finally exhale. But the map told a different story. The occupation zones, once just lines on diplomatic agreements, became borders enforced by armies. American forces occupied Western Germany. The Soviets controlled the East. Berlin, divided into sectors, became an island of fragile cooperation inside Soviet-held territory. Within months, the alliance began to fracture. Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe fell behind what Churchill would famously call an Iron Curtain. Berlin, instead of symbolizing unity, became the flashpoint of a new conflict. By 1948, the Soviets would blockade the city. By 1961, a wall would divide it. The Cold War, a global confrontation that would define the next half-century, had its roots in the decisions made during those final weeks of World War II. So was Eisenhower's decision his biggest mistake? By purely military logic, he was right. Germany surrendered. The alliance held through the end. American forces avoided the urban slaughter that consumed Berlin. Tens of thousands of lives were likely spared by not pursuing symbolic objectives. But history isn't measured only in casualties avoided. It's measured in consequences. By halting Patton at the Elbe, Eisenhower chose caution over conquest, coalition management over territorial ambition. He preserved unity with the Soviets, but he also ceded them control over half of Europe. Whether a race to Berlin would have changed that outcome is unknowable. What is certain is that the decision shaped the world that followed. Patton believed wars should be finished as decisively and quickly as possible, before politics could dilute victory into compromise. Eisenhower believed wars should be ended in ways that made the next one less likely, even if that meant accepting imperfect outcomes. Both philosophies had merit. Both had costs. Patton died in December 1945, never seeing the Cold War take shape. Eisenhower would go on to become president, navigating the tensions his wartime decisions helped create. The question remains unanswered, because perhaps it has no answer. In April 1945, the greatest decision of the war was not how to defeat Germany, but how to live with the victory. If you're fascinated by the tactical innovations and psychological warfare techniques that decided battles in World War II, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the untold stories of ordinary soldiers who achieved extraordinary results through ingenuity and courage. Don't miss our upcoming videos on the hidden tactics that changed history.